I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
It's time to begin our Bible study. If you remember now, last week we were looking at the prophetic visions in Daniel. And we were in chapter 7. If everybody opens your Bibles to Daniel, and I hand out verses this week, I'll try and not surprise you with one and 5 books back. It takes a little while to find it, but I'm thinking as we start into the minor prophets, it'll be a little tricky finding all of them, so I thought it might be good practice if we just keep using our Bibles, plus the fact that I don't have time to put all our verses up on the screen like Jared does. So, but I'll try and make it a little easier for us for time's sake. But we ended up last week in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 6. We were looking at the leopard with 4 wings, and we came to the conclusion that was Greece, the Empire of Greece. And the second beast, or the third now, that we're looking at is in verse 7, chapter 7, verse 7. And Daniel says here, "After this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong. And it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. This 10-horned beast here with the iron teeth, it's so terrible, is this world power, that if you notice, it wasn't even compared with an animal that in the previous 2 empires, the leopard and the bear. And this one, an animal couldn't describe its destructible force. But the comparison of iron, iron brings to mind, what does iron bring to mind to you?
Steel. It's like steel.
Yeah. What about, like, is it weak? Is it a weak metal?
No, it's tough. It's strong.
Right. It's the strength. No metal actually surpasses iron. So I thought about this. You know, we use iron for hammers, for sledgehammers. Cannonballs are made of and they're all used for battering, aren't they? And beating. It surpasses brass and silver in our other 2 comparisons, and gold. And this description is applicable to the Roman Empire. In nothing was it more remarkable than its strength. Remember all our studying in Revelations. It was a powerful empire. And the 10 horns, I believe, symbolize the power of that, but all the local powers within the Roman Empire. There were 10, for us to understand, 10 provinces within the Roman Empire. And I believe that is what God was having Daniel to understand. Something that I thought I might mention, that religion was a state affair in the world empires at that time. Not so much like now in our day and age, but success depended on who was stronger, the religious sector or the governmental. And Rome was no different. The horns here are simply state powers which had control over the religious affairs. And it seems without getting too deep into this, but it seems that the little horn arose and had conflict with the temporal power, subduing 3 of them. And some conclude that this could have been the papacy. Some conclude it was the Seleucid ruler, Antiochus, I think is his name. But the debate goes on and on over that.
Don't get too far into it.
Yeah.
This morning's lesson.
Oh, is it? Oh,
Yeah.
good. Okay. We'll leave that for Jeremy in this morning's lesson. There are some sections in the book, and I keep reminding myself also that this is just an overview. You know, the thought that Kala had at the end of the class. Maybe we can, I mentioned to Jeremy, you can make a sermon out of that. Then you have your time to explain, and sometimes in class we can tie up the whole class, and so I'll leave that for now. But anyways, in chapter 7, verses 9 to 14 now, we've come across this before. The next vision that follows is the vision of one like the Son of Man, receiving a kingdom from the Ancient of Days, which we showed earlier in our lessons by Scripture. That was to be Christ's kingdom. And so we won't go back into that at the moment. We can touch on that in a second here. But these 4 beasts now that we've looked at, they represent 4 world empires. And again, I remind us that what was Daniel praying about? He was asking God when this captivity was going to end. And God, instead of, remember he was reading in Jeremiah, but God answered his prayer in a way that he showed Daniel these world powers and how that he has control over who was running the world at that time. And that was the gist of all this. And it was the gist of these 4 beasts that represent the 4 empires, which would rise and fall in succession until the arrival of God's everlasting kingdom. And chapter 7, verses 17 and 18, we read there, these great beasts, which are 4 in number, are 4 kings who will arise from the earth. But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, for all ages to come. Which again, according to Scripture, is here. And we are in it now, that kingdom. Jeremy, do you want to, Colossians 1, I had 9 to 14. I guess okay. It'd be good to read that, yeah.
Want me to read the entire thing? Or
Yeah, okay, please.
For this reason we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you, and to ask that you be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, that you may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing him, being fruitful in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, strengthened with all might according to his glorious power, for all patience and long-suffering with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints of light. He has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of his love, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins.
Okay, it's undeniable, isn't it? Who this kingdom is that's being spoken of in Daniel. And Paul is telling the New Testament Christians that at this time at Colossae that they were in that kingdom. That kingdom has come. That prophecy has been fulfilled. And so I just thought we'd end this vision by reading verses 20 to 22 of Daniel chapter 2.
Daniel 7.
No, Daniel 2.
Okay.
Yeah. Daniel 2 verses 20 to 22. Do you want to read that, please?
20 to 22.
Daniel 2, 20 to 22.
Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons, he removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him.
Okay. Each of these empires that we looked at so far, and the one we'll look at now in Daniel's second vision, all thought they'd remain forever, didn't they? They held the world in their hands at this time. And the people, the subjects, probably thought the same thing. But we see that that is not true. God is in control. And God raises who he will, and he destroys who he will. So Daniel's second vision, this one came in the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign. In chapter 8, we're in now, in verse 1, we read that. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. And in this vision now, it consists of a 2-horned ram, which is defeated by a 1-horned male goat. And we read of that in chapter 8 from verses 3 to 7. And it's interesting, the comparison here, being raised on a farm, you'd think I'd have known this, but I had to look into it. But why the ram? What's the idea here of a ram being overtaken by a goat? Well, a ram is more powerful. Their horns are a lot stronger, and compared to a goat is not.
You said the ram was overtaken by the goat. It's the other way around, isn't it?
Yeah, right, sorry. Yeah, the ram was the more powerful one though, and it shouldn't have been taken over by especially a 1-horned goat. And that is why these comparisons, sometimes we don't understand that. Not many of us have goats and rams in our yards anymore. But in this day and age, that would have made complete sense. And we read there that whose horn is broken on the male goat and replaced by 4 horns. We read that in verses 8 to 14. But now this is interpreted to Daniel by the angel Gabriel as representing the Greek Empire's defeat of the Medo-Persian Empire. And that's in verses 15 to 21. We read of that interpretation of that vision. 21 says, the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So a lot of these visions, Gabriel has explained them, and it leaves no doubt in our mind. We don't need to run rampant with a lot of the religious world's interpretations of all this and looking for something that has not happened yet. And also we read in there that, as Jeremy has pointed out a few times in Revelations, that the Greek Empire broke up into 4 parts after Alexander was died. It was fought over amongst the power hungry of Greece, and there was 4 parts. And one of those was going to cause considerable harm to God's covenant people. And we won't go into that too much. And I thought it was interesting, sometimes we want to stress over a lot of these visions, and we see here that Daniel, even Daniel himself was, it says he felt sick trying to understand all this because he didn't know. God was the one in control and made. So if Daniel felt sick and stressed over what was happening, who do we think we are? We have what God has revealed to us, and we should be content with that. And Daniel's 3rd vision is presented by Gabriel again in the 1st year of Darius the mead in chapter 9. Remember, we had said that a lot of these visions came at different points in Daniel's life. And this one now is under the King Darius. And this was the ones in 70 weeks or sevens of years, representing the period of time in rebuilding the temple, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the coming of the Messiah, his ministry, and the death of the Messiah, and the eventual destruction of Jerusalem, including the final end of temple worship. And we said this before, that sometime we could maybe study this prophecy in depth, but for now we just take it at face value here. But we did come to the understanding that the fulfillment in 70 weeks of years was 490 years into the future. And if you remember Ezra began his work. Remember when Ezra went back to Jerusalem?
Sorry, you said 490 years. Is there a significance to that being 7 times 7 times 10 is 490?
Yeah, well, those were the years up until Christ and up until his death. And also, I read Homer Haley's thoughts on this, and it's hard to explain. There's a 62-week division in there. That's hard to explain that to the exact date. But I decided within myself, I'm not stressing over that. We know that Ezra went back to rebuild Jerusalem. We know the public ministry of Christ, roughly in the year it started. And then the conversion of Cornelius was when the salvation was offered to the Gentiles. And within that time period seems to fit the years of this prophecy. And so, like I said, it's, you know, we would have to have a whole class on that prophecy to do it. And there's a pile of numbers within it. But as I said, I'm convinced, because we know all those other things took place. And this was written for Daniel's understanding. Daniel was looking forward to what is happening to your covenant people. And God gave him this. Jared?
This is where a lot of premillennial doctrine comes from.
Right.
Because they will take Daniel 9 and then go to Revelations 11, 12, 13, 14, all that deal with the prophets that raised up, and the prophets will die, and the beast will come, and it's a misapplication of Scripture and a misunderstanding. And I'm not, as I said, we don't need to go into all the details, except to know that when our understanding of Scripture contradicts something that is a lot easier to understand, then it's our understanding that's wrong. And sometimes we don't have to know everything. Just know that God's plan worked.
Right.
And we can have faith in it even if we don't understand everything.
Exactly. And I've always wondered why Israel was in captivity right here in Babylon, and God is giving Daniel these visions to what he has. And in Revelations, Babylon's long gone. Now the New Testament Christians were a captivity of sorts to Rome. So why would it matter to them? What is the connection? Why would there be a connection between what God was telling Daniel and those in the first century, other than the fact that I'm in control? And that's what Revelations, John was trying to have the New Testament Christians understand. God's in control. We just need to remain faithful. And Daniel's fourth vision, the final one, comes in the third year now of Cyrus, and we're into chapter 10 and verse 1, where we read, in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belshazzar, and the message was true and one of great conflict. But he understood the message and had an understanding of the vision. And in this vision, Daniel sees a glorious man with a thundering voice. We read that in verses 4 to 9 in that description. And then he is told that the fourth king following Cyrus's reign over the Medo-Persian Empire would fight against Greece. And we read that in chapter 11 and verse 2. And there we read, and now I tell you the truth, behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia, then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. And eventually Greece would prevail, and under a mighty king whose short reign, which we think is Alexander, it would come to an end, and then that would result in his empire being divided into 4 parts. And they would then fight against one another. We read that in chapter 11, verses 5 to 35. These readings that take up our whole class, so I'm just giving them to you, and you can read them in your own time. But in this vision also, we see some realities here of the unseen world. God was showing Daniel how his angels were working, also under his orders in the affairs of the nations. You know, I think of Job 1 in verse 7, when Satan was roaming around looking for who he could devour. And we read that in chapter 2 and 1. And in Zechariah chapter 3 verses 1 and 2, we read of the same thing. You know, how the unseen, how God and his angels work, we don't understand, but we know they do work. In John 5 and verse 4, I just grabbed us a couple of New Testament passages to help us understand that. Remember in John 5 and verse 4, the healing at Bethesda, we read in verse 4, for an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first entered the pool, after the stirring up of the water, stepped in and was made well for whatever disease with which he was afflicted. And I only threw this point in for our awareness and our respect of who God is and how powerful he is. And it brought to mind Ephesians 6 and verse 12 to help us to build our strength and trust in God. And we're told in verse 12, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. And that verse always just reminds me of my need to be aware constantly. You know, we're always told in many sermons of our need to pray, our need to read, our need to constantly seek God and build that relationship, because we need it. You know, we're fighting against evil forces that could care less of our souls and are powerful with the world we live in. So I just thought that was interesting, that this is the first time we see a lot of that mentioned in the beginning of the Old Testament. Now we see quite a bit of it in Daniel. But we'll move on then. Any comments? We'll move on to the next section in the content. This is the rise and fall of kingdoms. The book of Daniel, if you remember, opens with the rise of Babylon, reaching its power, and the conquest of Judah. And it also contains a large portion of history on a number of different kingdoms, including the spiritual kingdom established by Christ. And we read that in chapter 7 verses 13 to 14. And now we're asked to name the 4 world empires. We go back to Daniel chapter 2. We'll be there for a bit. Name the 4 world empires that are to be associated with the various parts of the image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Read in Daniel 2, verses 31 to 35. But our first one is Daniel 2, verses 37 to 38. And I'll get Carla and Gord to read those 2 passages. Daniel 2, verses 37 and 38.
You, O King, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory.
And into whose hand he has given whoever they dwell, the children of men, the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, making you rule over all them all. You are the head of gold.
Okay, so who is the empire here?
Babylon.
Right, Jeremy, Babylon. Because who is Daniel speaking to when he says, "You, O king"?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Right. So it's pretty undeniable who that is. Daniel speaking to Nebuchadnezzar, and the kingdom he rules over is Babylon. He has the head of gold. And Daniel 2 and verse 39. Daniel 2 verse 39. Lisa, did you want to read that?
But after you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours, then another, a 3rd kingdom of bronze, we shall rule over all the earth.
Okay, now in this interpretation of the dream, Daniel tells the king that the chest and the arms of this statue were made of silver. And it's interesting to note now the silver is inferior to gold, isn't it? And when we think of that, the power of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was never to be copied, in that his word was absolute law in his kingdom. And Persia was inferior to that, as both king and the nobles shared in power. And thus that weakened the government by the growing independence of the individual provinces. But both were under God's control, and we read that in verse 38, that God is in control. Jeremy?
Plus, it's 2 kingdoms, it's the Medes and the Persians. We often lump them in together. Those are 2 people. Those are 2 different peoples.
Right.
The Persians are the Iranians today, and the Medes are, I think, a little bit further north and east to them. And that kingdom, Babylon, was a kingdom. The Medes and the Persians, they were 2 different peoples. They had laws that couldn't be changed.
Right.
So they were weaker.
Right. Yeah, and they say that the Persians were a more wicked lust for blood than were the Medes. So that too gives you an idea. But Belshazzar, who is now king in Babylon, God says this to him. Remember, we just read that God's under control. And he hasn't been in power very long, Belshazzar. But in chapter 5 and verse 28. James, do you want to read that, please? Yeah, chapter 5 and 28.
Press your kingdom. Yeah, Paris, your kingdom has been divided and has given to the Medes and Persians.
Okay. We read there then now, God in control again, and he's informing Belshazzar of what his intentions for Belshazzar are. We read that in chapter 8, verse 20 again. The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. And it's interesting, I just thought that I might have made mention of this later on, I can't remember, but it just came to my mind at this moment. Belshazzar, you know, Nebuchadnezzar was shown mercy by God, wasn't he? We will touch on that after. But with Belshazzar, he knew of the past. He knew of how God dealt with Nebuchadnezzar. And yet, this chapter opens with, what is he doing? He's in a reckless party, using the articles of the temple, drinking from them. Just total disgrace and towards God. Go ahead.
We also see that through the Jewish history too. They were brought out of Egypt, and as soon as Moses went up the mountain, they just let everything go, and they started making idols, and that's the nature of man when they lose focus on God.
I know, but some seem to be worse, don't they? Nebuchadnezzar was brought to his knees, but we see Belshazzar, just a blatant ruling out of God's laws. He could care less, And then Daniel 2 and verse 39 also, the belly and thighs of this statue, what were they made of? Okay, right. And Daniel refers to this empire more than once in such a manner that it can't be mistaken. If you read, look over to chapter 8 and verse 21, because I already read that. The shaggy goat represented who? Greece. So it's not hard for us to understand a lot of this prophecy. In chapter 10 and verse 20, we read here, then he said, do you understand why I came to you? That's the angel speaking to Daniel. But I shall now return to fight against the prince of Persia. So I am going forth, and behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. Just again, we see here the angels working with God, doing their duty. And the belly, I wondered, might have referred to the drunkenness of Alexander and the luxury that they lived under at that time. The Greeks were celebrated also for their bronze. Their army wore bronze shields. Everything was bronze by their warriors. And it's interesting to note that we read, where do we read ruler over all the earth?
That was in verse 39.
39?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Right. Well, it's interesting to note that Alexander had a coin made for himself because he thought at that time he was king of kings over the world. And he had a coin made in his honor. And written on that coin, he had king of the world put on there. And yet here we see another king then with his brazen attitude, and God takes him also out of the way. And verses 40 to 43. Who's there? Shadon, do you want to split that up if you want? 40 to 43?
Chapter 5
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2. Sorry.
40 to 43. Okay. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as everything, and like rushes. That kingdom will broke in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the foot and toes, party of potter's clay and hardened of iron. The kingdom shall be divided, yet these strings of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with certain clay.
And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of the fire, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly hard, and the rest so with iron mixed with men dry, they shall write the sex with the seed of man, but they shall not write one another. Iron as iron is not mixed with one.
Okay, and this kingdom's portrayed by what? How's it portrayed?
Well, it doesn't say.
No.
But because of verse 44, in these days the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. We know from the New Testament that it's Rome.
Right. It was portrayed by the two legs of iron, the feet of iron and clay. And if you recall our study in Revelations, how many times did we look into that and the meaning of that? And it's interesting that, yes, we read that empire was to be in existence at the time. It was symbolized by the cutting of the stone out of the mountain. And where have we read that? And who was that speaking of? Jeremy just told us, the kingdom of Christ. And the kingdom that was in control at the time of Christ was Rome, wasn't it? And it's interesting to note the decreasing value of metals now in Nebuchadnezzar's statue, isn't it? Started out with the golden head, and now with the feet and the toes and the legs, we're down now to iron mixed with clay. Kind of interesting, isn't it? And the two legs, we wonder if that maybe represented the eastern and the western wings of the kingdom. And as we said, the Roman Empire fits this description. And also I found it interesting in these visions that man pictures his empire as valuable metals, doesn't he? Nebuchadnezzar dreaming of his head of gold, and all the other empires working their way down. But how did God picture them in Daniel's first vision? He pictured them as wild beasts, didn't he? He pictured them as what they were and their attitude. And so I'll just go through these next few slides, and then next week we can finish this. Look, Dave just showed us now, here was the Babylonian Empire at this time. This was roughly, we think, 625 to 539 BC. And then Babylon being overtaken by the Medes and Persians. And this is the area that they control, 539 to 330 BC before Christ. And then the Greek Empire, we notice each of them get a little bigger, don't they? The Greek Empire, 330 BC to 146 BC. And then finally, the Roman Empire in the days of Christ, and the land masses and the area that it covered. And it, we figure, was 146 BC to 400 AD. So just kind of neat to see the power of each empire.
Depends on the Roman Empire what date you want to take.
Yeah.
The Eastern Roman Empire lasted till 1400 AD.
Oh, okay.
The Byzantine Empire is the Eastern Empire. The West fell in 400 and something, but the Roman Empire split into two, and the Byzantine Empire was eventually ended by the Muslims, the Turks, in 1451.
Right. I was reading that, and that was interesting. That's true. Well, okay, well, we'll leave at this, and then next week we'll finish with question 40.
I'm not ashamed to